Dear viewers, prepare yourselves for a tale shrouded in mystery and intrigue, a story that will pull you deep into a world of deception and hidden truths, narrated by Dr. Rami. This exclusive presentation for the Curious Case channel promises to keep you on the edge of your seat. The Whispering Shadows is a never-before-told enigma, set against the backdrop of 1920s London, a time when secrets were currency and danger lurked behind every closed door. The city, still reeling from the aftershocks of war, was a breeding ground for espionage and clandestine affairs. The elite whispered of missing artifacts, encrypted messages, and strangers who vanished without a trace. Our story begins in the heart of Mayfair, where an unassuming gentleman stumbles upon a too-good-to-be-true rental offer, a lavish flat, at an absurdly low price. The catch: a series of tenants before him had all disappeared, leaving behind only cryptic notes and a lingering sense of dread. Drawn into a labyrinth of unsolved mysteries, he soon realizes he is not just a tenant, he is a pawn in a sinister game played by forces far beyond his understanding. As the walls of his new home seem to whisper secrets of their own, he must unravel the truth, before he too vanishes into the darkness. I had never met the couple before. Mr. and Mrs. Langley were new acquaintances of my friend Carter. The conversation had naturally drifted towards house hunting, a favorite topic of Carter's, given his relentless search for the perfect home. Just as he was recounting his latest near success, Mrs. Langley, a charming woman with an air of quiet excitement, leaned in with a knowing smile. "Speaking of flats, have you heard about our incredible stroke of luck, Mr. Carter? We've secured a place finally," she announced, her voice carrying an unmistakable thrill. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Oh, whereabouts?" "Blackwood Court," she declared, watching for his reaction. The name alone was enough to cause a ripple of interest. Blackwood Court was one of those grand, imposing buildings in the heart of Kensington, elegant, well-maintained, and notoriously expensive. Carter let out a low whistle. Well, always said you'd find a good spot if you had the patience. "So how much is this dream home setting you back?" Mrs. Langley exchanged a quick glance with her husband before replying. "Only £85 a year," she said lightly. The room fell silent. Carter blinked. "Sorry, did you say 85? She nodded, her expression turning slightly amused at his reaction. "But that's absurd," Carter said, shaking his head. "That place goes for at least triple that. What's the catch?" "There isn't one, Mr." Langley interjected, though his tone suggested he had asked himself the same question more than once. "At least nothing obvious. We only had to buy the furnishings, just £60, and everything's practically new, solid oak, velvet upholstery, the works." Carter laughed incredulously. "Now I know there's a catch. No one sells a furnished flat at Blackwood Court for pennies, unless there's a reason. So tell me, did the previous tenants happen to vanish in the night? Any tales of ghostly figures lurking in the corridors, Mrs.?" Langley hesitated, the flicker of unease in her eyes betraying a thought she hadn't dared voice until now. "That's just it," she murmured. "We never met them. The landlord handled everything. Apparently they left in a hurry, didn't even collect some of their personal belongings. It's strange, isn't it? Almost as if they were running from something." A chill settled over the conversation. What had seemed like an incredible deal now bore the unmistakable scent of mystery. Carter, ever the skeptic, shook his head decisively. "No ghosts, no hidden curses, just an absurdly cheap flat in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in London. Makes perfect sense." But Mrs. Langley still looked unconvinced. Her fingers toyed absent-mindedly with the edge of her scarf, her expression troubled. "Still," she murmured, "there were a few things about it that struck me as odd." I leaned in slightly, intrigued. "For instance?" Carter let out a chuckle, sensing my curiosity. "Ah, you've caught Hastings' attention now. He's got a nose for these things. Go on, Mrs. Langley, tell him everything. He's quite the expert when it comes to mysteries." I laughed at the exaggeration, though I couldn't deny that something about this story had already unsettled me. "Not an expert, really," I said. "But I do enjoy a good puzzle. What exactly seemed off to you?" She hesitated, as though debating whether she was being foolish, then took a breath. Well, when we first started looking for a place, we visited Barrington and Company, the big property agents in Mayfair. They only deal with high-end rentals, but we thought, why not check? It couldn't hurt. She paused. Everything they showed us was well out of our range, $400–500 a year, some requiring absurd premiums up front. We were about to leave when, almost as an afterthought, the agent mentioned a flat at Blackwood Court going for just £85. He even seemed hesitant about bringing it up. Why? I asked, frowning. She shook her head. I don't know, he just said something vague about it not being for everyone. We were intrigued, of course, so we asked to see it. The moment we agreed, he seemed almost relieved, as though he'd been worried we wouldn't take the bait. Mr. Langley, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was something guarded in his tone. And then there was the matter of the previous tenants. Mrs. Langley nodded. Yes. No one could really tell us much about them, just that they left suddenly. No notice, no forwarding address. They abandoned some of their things, even. A hush fell over the conversation. I glanced at Carter, whose casual grin had faded slightly. A luxury flat, absurdly cheap, with previous occupants, who left in a hurry, and an agent who seemed too eager to pass it off. I murmured, that does sound peculiar. Peculiar, Carter scoffed, though with less conviction than before. Sounds like a deal if you ask me. Mrs. Langley sighed, as if trying to shake off her unease. Maybe, but tell me, Captain Hastings, have you ever heard of a place being too good to be true? I didn't reply, because I had. And it never ended well. Mrs. Langley hesitated for a moment, then continued, her voice carrying the weight of lingering uncertainty. The agent at Barrington and Company seemed oddly hesitant, almost dismissive when he mentioned the Blackwood Court flat. He even told us it had been on their books for some time, which, as you know, is highly unusual for a place in that part of London. The way he put it, they had sent so many people to view it, that it was practically guaranteed to be taken. Snapped up, as he phrased it. She paused, only oddly enough, no one ever did. Carter frowned. No one. Mrs. Langley nodded. Apparently people would see it, show interest, and then disappear. They never followed up. The agency kept assuming it was rented, but weeks would pass, and the landlord would call again, saying it was still available. It became almost an irritation, sending prospective tenants there, only to have them vanish into thin air afterward. She exhaled, as though still trying to make sense of it. The agent seemed almost relieved when we insisted on taking an order to view it. He warned us though, told us we'd probably find it had already been let, but we thought, why not check? We took a cab straight there, no hesitation. Mr. Langley, who had remained quiet so far, finally spoke. Flat no. 62nd floor, he said grimly. And just as we were waiting for the lift, someone came hurrying down the stairs. Elsa Ferguson, a friend of ours. She and her husband have been flat hunting for weeks. Mrs. Langley nodded. She spotted me immediately, and stopped, breathless. Ahead of you for once, my dear. She joked. Then she shook her head. But it's no good. It's already let. And with that, she rushed out the door. I exchanged a glance with Carter. That should have been the end of it, I murmured. Exactly, Mrs. Langley agreed. By all logic, we should have turned around and left. But something about the whole thing, the too good to be true price, the agent's odd reluctance, the way Elsa had practically run out of there, made us hesitate. And then John said the very thing I had been thinking. It's too cheap. She shivered slightly, as though recalling something unpleasant. So we went upstairs anyway, and that, Captain Hastings, is when things became truly strange. Mrs. Langley leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping, as though reluctant to say what came next. We decided, perhaps if we offered a premium, we might persuade them to take us instead. It felt rather underhanded, and I confess it was, but you know how it is when flat hunting. A moment's hesitation, and someone else swoops in, and you're back at square one. I nodded, fully aware of the ruthless nature of securing a home in London. "Dog eat dog," I muttered. "Precisely." Mrs. Langley gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "So we went up anyway, and would you believe it? The flat wasn't let at all." Carter sat forward. "What?" Mrs. Langley nodded. "Not let, not even spoken for. We were shown around by a maid, calm, polite, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Then we met the mistress of the house, and within minutes it was settled. Immediate possession, £50 for the furniture. We signed the agreement the next day." Her voice lowered slightly. "We move in tomorrow." A silence stretched between us, and then Carter spoke, his voice measured. "And Mrs. Ferguson?" Mrs. Langley let out a breath. "That's the part I don't understand. Why did she say it was already let? She wasn't mistaken. She was certain. It wasn't a casual assumption. She had rushed down the stairs, practically warning us off. And yet, the moment we went up, there it was, empty, waiting for us, as though it had always been ours." Something cold flickered at the edge of my thoughts. A puzzle with pieces that refused to fit. Why would the agent try to dissuade them? Why had so many before them vanished without a trace, after viewing it? Why had Mrs. Ferguson, an honest, level-headed woman, been so convinced it was already taken? I met Carter's gaze, and from his expression, I knew he was thinking the same thing. Something about this wasn't right. Something about this was very, very wrong. "My dear Watson," I quipped lightly, stretching back in my chair, "she must have simply gone to the wrong flat." Mrs. Langley gasped in delight. "Oh, Captain Hastings, how terribly clever of you." I smiled modestly, though in truth I wished Poirot had been present to witness my deduction. Too often, I felt he underestimated my capabilities. A small triumph, perhaps, but a satisfying one nonetheless. The story lingered in my mind the next morning, amusing enough to present as a mock problem to Poirot over breakfast. He listened with that peculiar stillness of his, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his head cocked ever so slightly in thought. Then, to my surprise, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "A curious story indeed, mon ami," he murmured, "most curious," and with that he rose abruptly, reaching for his hat and cane. "Excuse me, Hastings, I must take a short stroll." A stroll. At this hour, I opened my mouth to question him, but he was already at the door, slipping out with a purposeful energy that left me oddly unsettled. An hour passed, then another. Just as I was considering setting out in search of him, the door swung open. Poirot entered, his expression alight with something I could only describe as triumphant exhilaration. He crossed the room briskly, placed his stick carefully upon the table, and removed his hat. With the greatest care, he brushed the nap, ensuring not a single hair was out of place. Then at last he turned to me. "Hastings," he said, his voice smooth and measured, yet carrying the unmistakable tremor of excitement, "I believe we have stumbled upon something most extraordinary. It is just as well, mon ami, that we have no pressing matters at hand," Poirot remarked, his eyes gleaming with an intensity I knew all too well. "We may devote ourselves entirely to this most peculiar affair." I blinked at him in bewilderment. "Affair," I repeated. "What affair?" "The remarkable cheapness of Mrs. Robinson's new flat, the Ansuye." He leaned forward, his fingertips pressed together in a delicate pyramid. "Poirot, you cannot be serious." He met my gaze, utterly solemn. "I am always serious, Hastings. Consider this. The true rent of those Montague Mansions flats is £350. I have just confirmed this with the landlord's agents, and yet, this particular flat is being sublet for £80. He paused, allowing the implications to settle in my mind. "Why?" I frowned. "Well, there must be something wrong with it. Perhaps it is haunted," I offered, recalling Mrs. Robinson's own jest. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. "Poofed, haunted." He gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "You English and your ghosts. No, no, Hastings, this is something else entirely. The numbers, they do not add up." I leaned back, considering his words. "It is rather odd," I admitted, "but it could simply be an error, or a desperate landlord." "None," Poirot interrupted sharply. "There is no desperation, only deception. And tell me this, how curious is it that Mrs. Robinson's friend was absolutely certain the flat had already been let. She saw someone, spoke to someone, and yet, when Mrs. Robinson herself arrived, voila, the flat was miraculously available. The unease in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt a prickle of apprehension along my spine. "You suspect something sinister," I murmured. Poirot nodded slowly. "It is no mere coincidence, mon cher Hastings. There is a pattern, and where there is a pattern," he tapped his temple lightly, "there is a mystery to unravel." A chill passed over me as I realized the game was already afoot, and as I watched Poirot rise, straighten his cuffs and reach for his hat once more, I knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary case. The other woman must have gone to the wrong flat, I insisted. That's the only possible explanation. Poirot did not look convinced. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingertips together. "Perhaps. But the fact remains, Hastings, many people were sent to see this flat, and yet, in spite of its remarkable cheapness, it remained mysteriously unclaimed, until Mrs. Robinson arrived." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken meaning. "That suggests," Poirot continued, "that something is very wrong about it." A shiver ran down my spine. "But Mrs. Robinson saw nothing amiss," I countered. "She was delighted." "Precisely," Poirot interjected, his sharp gaze piercing into me. "She saw nothing, and yet, every other person who stepped foot inside that flat refused it. Why?" I struggled for an answer. I don't know." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Hastings, did she strike you as an honest woman?" I hesitated. "She was charming." Poirot sighed. "Ah, the great Achilles heel of my dear Hastings, a charming woman." And suddenly his powers of deduction fail him completely. I bristled. "Not at all," I declared. "She was tall, fair, with the most stunning auburn hair." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Auburn hair. But of course, you have always had a weakness for auburn-haired women, mon ami." I ignored his smirk. "Blue eyes, a lovely complexion." "She seemed sincere, Poirot, completely genuine." Poirot's expression grew unreadable. He remained silent for a long moment before murmuring, almost to himself, "And yet, she moves into a flat no one else dares to take. A flat where something unseen lingers in the shadows." The weight of his words pressed against me. I swallowed. "Poirot, what do you think is going on?" He met my gaze, and in that moment I saw it, the glint of excitement in his eyes, the certainty of a mind already at work unraveling the truth. "I do not think, mon ami. I know something is terribly, terribly wrong." I hesitated, grasping for the right words. "Well, that's all, I suppose." "And her husband?" Poirot pressed. "Oh, he's a decent enough fellow. Nothing remarkable. Not particularly dark, nor fair. Just ordinary." Poirot gave a small thoughtful nod. "Yes, there are many such men, faceless in a crowd, easily forgotten." He turned his sharp gaze to me. "And yet, mon ami, you bring far more attention to your descriptions of women. A most interesting flaw in your observation skills." I bristled at the accusation. "Not at all. It's just that there wasn't much to say about him. They're recent acquaintances of Parker's, that's all. Just a perfectly normal couple." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "And yet, nothing about this affair seems normal." A chill ran down my spine. "Surely, Poirot, you don't suspect anything." He raised a hand, silencing me. "Did I say I suspect? No, Hastings. I only say this. Something about this story does not sit right with me. A flat that is curiously cheap, a stream of potential tenants who mysteriously refuse it, a woman who secures it as if by fate, and no explanation for any of it. Do you not feel it, mon ami, that something is missing?" I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling uneasy. "But there's nothing to suggest any wrongdoing." Poirot's lips twitched, a knowing smile dancing at the edges. "Perhaps, Hastings. Or perhaps the truth is merely waiting to be uncovered, and maybe, just maybe, the clue lies in the lady's name." I frowned. "Her name? Oui, mon ami. What did you say her name was?" "Stella," I answered stiffly, unsure why it mattered. "But I don't see." Poirot burst into a sudden rich chuckle. His eyes gleamed with amusement. yet beneath it there was something else, an excitement, a certainty that made my stomach tighten. "Ah, but Hastings," he murmured, tapping a finger against his temple, "Stella means a star." His laughter faded, and a heavy silence settled between us. A star, a guiding light in the darkness, or perhaps something meant to distract from the truth. And suddenly I realized, this was only the beginning. Poirot adjusted his hat with deliberate care, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Does it not intrigue you, Hastings? Stars give light, and light often reveals what is hidden in darkness." I sighed, exasperated. "Poirot, must you always speak in riddles?" He chuckled. "Ah, mon ami, patience. Let us go to Montague Mansions and see what secrets we may uncover." Despite my reluctance, I followed him. The building loomed before us, a pristine, well-maintained structure with an air of quiet dignity. A uniformed porter stood at the entrance, soaking in the afternoon sun. His face was set in a perpetual scowl, the kind that suggested he did not take kindly to idle chatter. Poirot approached him smoothly. "Pardon, monsieur, but could you tell me if a Mr. and Mrs. Robinson reside here?" The porter barely spared us a glance. "Flat 4, second floor," he grunted. Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, and if I may trouble you further, how long have they been living here?" 6 months, the porter said curtly. I felt the ground shift beneath me. 6 months, I blurted out, stepping forward. "That's impossible." The man finally looked up, unimpressed by my outburst. 6 months, he repeated with certainty. My pulse quickened. There must be a mistake. The lady Mrs. Robinson told me they had only just moved in. Poirot's expression remained unchanged, but I could see it, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He had known, he had suspected, and now the truth was beginning to surface. "Very curious, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot murmured. "A flat too cheap for its worth, a stream of tenants who never stayed, and now a couple who claims to have just arrived, yet has in fact been here for half a year." A cold weight settled in my stomach. Something was terribly wrong, and we were only scratching the surface. The porter's face remained indifferent, his expression one of disinterest. Tall, fair, reddish gold hair. "Aye, that's her. Moved in Michaelmas Quarter 6 months ago." He shrugged, as though the information was of little consequence, and turned away, shuffling back down the hall. I felt a strange chill. 6 months, but that was impossible. Mrs. Robinson had assured me they had just moved in. I turned to Poirot, expecting him to look equally startled, but instead I found him wearing that knowing little smirk of his, the one that always meant he had anticipated this all along. "Well, Hastings," he said lightly as we stepped outside, "are you still quite so convinced that charming women always speak the truth?" I opened my mouth, but found I had no answer. Poirot led the way briskly toward Brompton Road. It wasn't until we had walked a few blocks that I finally managed to ask, "Where are we going?" "To the house agent's, mon ami. I find myself rather taken with Montague Mansions. I suspect we shall witness some most interesting events there soon." A sense of foreboding stirred within me, but I followed him without question. We were in luck. Flat No. 8, 4th floor was available, fully furnished, 10 guineas a week. Before I could even blink, Poirot had signed for it, taking it for a full month. Back on the street, I finally found my voice. "Poirot, this is madness. You've just taken a flat for no reason at all." He waved away my protest with a smile. "Aye, mon Hastings, I have a very good reason. Besides, one must occasionally indulge in a whim, n'est-ce pas?" Then with a sudden shift in tone, his gaze sharpened. "By the way, Hastings, do you own a revolver?" A thrill ran through me. "Yes," I admitted. "Somewhere." Poirot's smile did not waver. "Good, you may find that you will need it." Asterisk. And just like that, the air around us thickened with something unseen yet unmistakable. A game was afoot, and I had the sinking suspicion that we were walking straight into something dark, something deadly. It was quite possible, I supposed, that I was letting my imagination run away with me, but Poirot's knowing smirk told me he had already seen several steps ahead. "Always, my friend, you are drawn to the spectacular and the romantic," he murmured. The following day, We moved into our temporary home. The flat was nearly identical to the Robinsons', only 2 floors higher. It was comfortably furnished, but I found it difficult to feel at ease. Something about the building unsettled me, an almost imperceptible tension in the air, as if the walls themselves held secrets. Sunday afternoon, Poirot left our front door slightly ajar, gesturing for me to stay silent. Then, a sudden noise, a sharp bang, echoing from below. Quickly, Hastings, look over the banister, but do not let yourself be seen. Heart pounding, I craned my neck over the railing. A man and woman were exiting the Robinsons' flat, their movements brisk, almost hurried. That's them, I whispered. Boom! Poirot nodded approvingly. We wait. Half an hour passed in tense silence. Then another figure emerged, a young woman, dressed in bold, garish colors, her outfit lowered against the dim corridor. Her gait was light, almost careless, but something about the way she glanced over her shoulder made my skin prickle. Poirot exhaled, a satisfied sigh escaping his lips. Silently he retreated back into our flat, closing the door behind him. And there we have it, Hastings, he murmured. First the master and mistress, and now the maid. The flat should be empty. I swallowed hard. The meaning of his words was clear, and though Poirot's voice was calm, I could feel the storm of deduction raging behind his eyes. Something was waiting for us inside that flat, and soon enough we were going to find out what. Now the flat should be empty, Poirot murmured, his eyes gleaming with calculated excitement. I shifted uneasily. And what exactly are we going to do? I asked, already suspecting I wouldn't like the answer. Without responding, Poirot trotted briskly toward the small scullery at the end of our flat. I followed, watching with growing alarm as he grasped the thick rope of the coal lift and gave it an experimental tug. The old wooden contraption creaked ominously. We are about to descend, he announced, in the manner of the dustbins. No one will observe us. The Sunday concert, the Sunday afternoon stroll, and most importantly, the Sunday nap after the great English roast beef feast will ensure that curiosity is at its lowest. I stared at him in dismay. You mean to say we're going down in that precisament? Poirot stepped onto the unsteady platform with the casual ease of a man boarding a first-class train carriage. He gestured for me to follow. With extreme reluctance, I climbed in beside him, feeling the wooden planks shift under our weight. The shaft was dark, the air thick with dust, and the faint scent of coal residue. Poirot grasped the rope and began lowering us, his small frame surprisingly adept at the task. Are we breaking into the flat? I whispered, as the dim outline of the Robinsons' window grew closer. Poirot chuckled softly. Not precisely, today. His tone was light, but the implication was unmistakable. This was only the beginning, and I had the dreadful suspicion that whatever lay ahead was far more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. We descended slowly, the rickety wooden contraption swaying under our weight. Every creak of the rope sent a shiver down my spine, but Poirot remained unfazed, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit shaft. As we neared the second floor, he let out a quiet murmur of satisfaction. You observe, mon ami, he whispered, nodding toward the wooden scullery door, unlocked. Just as I suspected. Indeed, the door stood slightly ajar, swinging lazily in the faint draught. My breath hitched. But surely this is sheer carelessness. Anyone could enter this way. Poirot gave me an amused glance. Carelessness, or convenience. His voice was smooth, deliberate. One must ask who benefits from such an oversight. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and began working on the bolt with an efficiency that unsettled me. His fingers moved swiftly, adjusting the mechanism so that it could be pulled back with ease from inside the lift. My unease deepened. What exactly are you doing? I whispered, shifting nervously as I cast a glance over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear from the darkness. Taking precautions, my friend. Poirot's voice was calm but firm. Should we need to return in less conventional circumstances, it would be most inconvenient to find ourselves locked out. My stomach clenched. The implication was clear. We were preparing for something far more daring than mere observation. Within minutes, Poirot had completed his task, tucking away his tools with a satisfied nod. We reascended the way we had come, the climb feeling far more treacherous than the descent. When we finally stepped back into the safety of our own flat, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. On Monday, Poirot vanished for the entire day without explanation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the brink of something far more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. When Poirot returned that evening, his face bore the look of a man who had unraveled a most intriguing puzzle. He sank into his chair with a sigh of satisfaction, his small fingers drumming lightly on the armrests. "Hastings," he said, a glint of amusement in his eyes, "shall I tell you a story, a tale worthy of your beloved cinema, filled with intrigue, betrayal, and espionage?" I leaned forward, intrigued. "Go ahead," I said with a chuckle, "as long as this one isn't a product of your fertile imagination." "Ah, mon ami," Poirot wagged a finger at me, "this story is quite real. The Inspector of Scotland Yard himself will attest to its authenticity. Now listen carefully." He paused for effect, then continued in a hushed, deliberate tone. "A little over 6 months ago, a theft occurred in an American government department. Not just any theft, Hastings. Important naval plans were stolen. These documents detailed the defenses of key harbors, blueprints that could shift the balance of power in the wrong hands. Imagine the value of such intelligence. Japan, for example, would pay a fortune to acquire them." I stiffened, my curiosity now fully piqued. "Suspicion fell on a man named Luigi Valdano," Poirot went on, his voice smooth yet chilling, "an Italian by birth, a man with connections to more than one intelligence agency, a man accustomed to moving in the shadows." He paused, steepling his fingers. "And Hastings, you will be most interested to know, Luigi Valdano was last seen in London." A cold prickle ran down my spine. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier. "And now," Poirot said softly, his eyes twinkling with something between mischief and calculation, "we must ask ourselves, where does this Valdano hide? Who shelters him? And most importantly, why is he so interested in Montague Mansions?" I swallowed hard. Whatever game we had stumbled into, it was becoming more dangerous by the second. Poirot leaned forward, his sharp eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Hastings," he murmured, "what if I told you that our little mystery extends far beyond London, that it is not just a matter of stolen documents, but of international intrigue, betrayal, and a game played in the shadows?" I sat up, the weight of his words settling over me. "Go on," I said, my curiosity piqued. "6 months ago," Poirot began, "a theft occurred in an American government office. Not just any theft, highly classified naval blueprints disappeared, maps detailing the coastal defenses of key strategic ports, a fortune to any foreign power, perhaps Japan, perhaps another nation, with interest in destabilizing the balance." I nodded, sensing where this was heading. "A minor employee, Luigi Valdano, vanished the same night. Whether he was the thief or merely a pawn in the game, we do not know. What we do know is this: 2 days later, Valdano was found dead on the east side of New York, a single bullet to the heart, and the documents, gone." Poirot's voice dropped lower, more measured. "Now Hastings, Valdano had been seen in the company of a young woman, a Miss Elsa Hart, a singer, charming, beautiful, and yet completely unknown before her sudden rise in Washington's social circles. Then, as mysteriously as she appeared, she vanished, disappeared the same night Valdano was murdered." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You think she had the documents?" Poirot smiled faintly. "I think Miss Hart is not who she claims to be. American intelligence believes she is, in fact, a highly skilled international spy, one who has operated under many names, across many borders. She is not a woman to be underestimated, mon ami." He tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. "Now, here is where things become even more interesting. The Americans suspected she would make contact with a certain group, quiet men, insignificant on the surface, yet well placed in the affairs of another nation. They watched, they waited. Then, a fortnight ago, one of these gentlemen left Washington, for England." Poirot leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now, Hastings, we must ask ourselves, where is Elsa Hart? And more importantly," he let the moment stretch, savoring the tension, "who is she planning to meet?" I swallowed, the realization dawning on me. We were no longer simply following a curious case. We had just stepped into the heart of a deadly game. Poirot's voice was measured, deliberate. And now, mon ami, the official description. Elsa Hart, height, 5'7", eyes blue, hair auburn gold, fair complexion, nose straight, no distinguishing marks. I stiffened, my pulse quickened. Mrs. Robinson, I gasped. Poirot inclined his head slightly. There is a possibility, Hastings. A strong one. He let the moment hang before adding, also I have learned that a man, a foreigner, quiet, watchful, was inquiring about the occupants of number 4 only this morning. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Then, she's in danger. Poirot tapped his fingers together, his eyes unreadable. Perhaps, or perhaps, she is the danger. I swallowed. The air in our small flat suddenly felt heavier. And so, my friend, Poirot continued, tonight we shall forego our usual comforts. There will be no early retirement for you, no peaceful dreams of charming young women. Instead, we shall keep watch in the flat below. A most important guest may arrive, and you will bring that excellent revolver of yours, n'est-ce pas? I felt my spine straighten. Rather, I exclaimed, the thrill of the hunt coursing through me. When do we begin? Poirot glanced at his pocket watch, a faint smile on his lips. Midnight, mon cher. The hour when shadows deepen, and secrets reveal themselves. Asterisk. And so, as the clock struck 12, we crept through the silent corridors of Montague Mansions, the world outside lost in slumber. With calculated precision, we slipped into the coal lift, Poirot's deft fingers manipulating the mechanisms with eerie ease. Slowly we descended, the rickety platform swaying beneath us. The second floor loomed closer. With a whisper of movement, Poirot unlatched the wooden door, its creak slicing through the silence. We stepped into the scullery, our breaths measured, our senses alert. Beyond lay the kitchen, and beyond that, the unknown. Something was waiting for us in the dark. We settled into our positions, 2 chairs facing the hallway, the door left ajar, just enough to catch the slightest sound. The air in the flat was thick with silence, pressing down like an unseen weight. Now we wait, Poirot murmured, folding his arms and closing his eyes as if he were about to take an afternoon nap. For me, the waiting was unbearable. Time stretched, warped. My senses were on high alert, straining for the faintest sound. My fingers tightened around the revolver in my coat pocket. The minutes dragged on, 10, 20, 30, until I was convinced that we had been sitting there for hours. Later I would learn it had only been 1 hour and 20 minutes exactly. Then, a sound, a faint, deliberate scratching. Poirot's hand found mine in the dark, his touch light but firm. I stiffened. He inclined his head, and we moved together, inching toward the hall, our steps measured and silent. The sound was clearer now, a delicate but persistent scrape, the unmistakable whisper of metal against metal. Poirot leaned in, his breath barely a ghost against my ear. They are cutting the lock, he murmured. He works carefully, but soon he will be inside. When I give the signal, not before, strike hard and hold fast. Be ready. He will have a knife. Asterisk. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my throat. The scratching paused, a breath of silence. Then, a sharp, rending sound. A small, eerie circle of light appeared through the splintering wood of the door. The intruder was nearly inside. Poirot tensed beside me, his body coiled, ready. My own fingers tightened around the revolver's grip, my heart pounding against my ribs. We were moments away from coming face to face with the unknown. The door creaked open ever so slowly, the darkness swallowing the figure that slipped inside. Poirot and I flattened ourselves against the wall, barely breathing. The intruder's footsteps were measured, cautious. Then, a sharp flick, and a torchlight sliced through the blackness. Now, Poirot hissed. We moved as one. Poirot lunged forward, a light woolen scarf, snapping around the man's head in a swift, practiced motion, muffling any chance of a cry. I grabbed his arms, twisting sharply to disarm him. A gleam of steel, a dagger, flashed in the dim light. I wrenched it free from his grip, my heart pounding. Poirot yanked the scarf down just enough to expose the intruder's eyes while keeping it tight around his mouth. I raised my revolver, leveling it so he could see that resistance was futile. The man froze, his body going rigid. Poirot leaned in, his voice a low, urgent whisper in the captive's ear. The man remained still for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Poirot gestured toward the door. "Come silently." We moved as shadows down the staircase, our captive walking ahead of me, Poirot leading the way. I gripped the revolver tightly, my mind racing. Who was this man? And why did Poirot seem to know exactly how to handle him? Stepping out into the street, Poirot turned to me. "A taxi waits just around the corner. Mon ami, the revolver, if you please, we shall not need it now." I hesitated but handed it over. "And if he tries to run?" I asked warily. Poirot merely smiled. "He will not." I fetched the taxi, my mind reeling. When I returned, the scarf had been unwound from our captive's face. The sight that met me sent a jolt of surprise through my system. "He's not," I started. "Ah, Hastings, your observation skills never fail to amaze." Poirot cut in smoothly. "Ah, he is not a he is Italian." We climbed into the taxi, Poirot giving the driver an address in St. John's Wood. I clenched my jaw, struggling to make sense of the situation. The drive was silent. When we arrived at a modest house set back from the road, Poirot led us to the door. A lone drunkard staggered down the pavement, nearly colliding with Poirot, who snapped something at him in a low, sharp tone. The man blinked, nodded, and stumbled away. Poirot rang the bell. No answer. He rang again, still nothing. Then, without warning, he seized the knocker and hammered with relentless force. A light flickered on above the fanlight. A moment later, the door cracked open just an inch. "What the devil do you want?" a gruff voice demanded. "A doctor," Poirot exclaimed. "My wife. She is ill. You must help." "There's no doctor here," the man snapped, moving to slam the door shut. Poirot was quicker. He wedged his foot in the gap, his demeanor instantly shifting into a furious caricature of an outraged Frenchman. "No doctor. Impossible. I will have the law on you. I will stand here and ring this bell all night." The man hesitated, glancing around uneasily. Poirot made a dramatic move to descend the steps. "I will call the police." "No, wait." The man lunged after him, desperation flashing across his face. With a swift shove, Poirot sent him stumbling back. In an instant, we were inside, the door locked behind us. "Quickly in here," Poirot commanded. Our captive moved with practiced ease, vanishing behind the heavy rose-colored curtains of a window alcove. Just in time, a woman burst into the room. She was tall, her red hair a tousled halo around her face, a scarlet kimono clutched tightly around her frame. "Where is my husband?" she demanded, her voice sharp, her eyes darting between us. "Who are you?" Poirot stepped forward with a polite bow. "Ah, madame, it is unfortunate that we have not been formally introduced." He gestured toward the curtains. "Especially since one of our party has traveled all the way from New York just to meet you." The drapes parted. The Italian stepped forward. My stomach clenched as I saw what he was holding. My revolver. I had left it unattended for mere moments in the cab, and now, the woman let out a sharp, piercing scream. She turned to flee, but Poirot was already at the door, blocking her escape. The game was over. "Let me go," she shrieked, her voice raw with terror. "He'll kill me. You don't understand. He'll kill me." The Italian's grip on the revolver tightened as his dark eyes swept over us, daring us to move. The weight of the moment pressed down, the air thick with danger. "Who was it that silenced Luigi Valdano?" the Italian demanded, his voice like steel, his finger resting on the trigger. The glint in his eyes was menacing, calculating. He raised the gun, leveling it at each of us in turn, his expression daring us to answer. My breath caught in my throat. This was spiraling out of control. "My God, Poirot, this is madness. What do we do?" I gasped. Poirot, calm as ever, raised a hand. "Hastings, mon ami, I must ask you to cease your dramatics. Our fiery friend will not shoot, not until I give him reason to." The Italian let out a low, chilling laugh. "You're sure about that, eh?" He cocked his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. I wasn't sure at all, but Poirot was, and then like a viper striking, Elsa turned. There was a flicker of motion, her hand flashing toward the black velvet cat that draped over the telephone. In an instant she had it clutched in her grasp. Poirot smiled. "Ah, très bien, mademoiselle. I had no doubt you would understand." The Italian's gaze snapped to her. "No," he bellowed. He lunged, but Poirot was quicker. With a subtle step, he blocked the doorway, his small frame somehow radiating authority. "The jewels," Poirot mused, nodding toward the heavy fabric in Elsa's hands. "Hidden in the lining, I presume." "Clever, very clever indeed." Elsa wasted no time. She bolted for the door, her kimono billowing behind her. The Italian roared in fury, his rage boiling over. He lifted the revolver, his finger tightening on the trigger. A single deafening shot rang out, and then nothing. A dull, empty click. Poirot sighed. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, you wound me with your lack of faith. I would never allow our dear friend to carry a loaded weapon." The Italian froze, realization dawning in his eyes. "You," he spat, his fury unmatched. Poirot gave a small apologetic shrug. "I do not care for unnecessary bloodshed, and I certainly do not permit mere acquaintances to carry deadly firearms." The Italian let out a string of curses, but Poirot merely observed him with mild reproach, as one would a misbehaving child. Now, my friend," he chided. "See how I have done you a favor. Had you fired, you would be hanging from a noose before the week's end. Instead, you will live to see another day." Outside, the heavy pounding of boots signaled the arrival of the police. Poirot straightened his cuffs. "Ah, and as for our beautiful lady, no, she will not escape. The house is watched, front and back. Even now she is walking straight into the arms of the law." The Italian's shoulders slumped, his fate sealed. I turned to Poirot, my mind reeling. "But how did you know?" Poirot's eyes twinkled as he dusted off his sleeves. "Ah, mon ami, the solution was always in front of us. It was all too convenient, was it not? This elaborate ruse, Elsa Hart and her accomplice knew they were being hunted, and so they concocted a brilliant deception. A common name, a flat offered at an absurdly low price, a baited trap designed to lure in the right kind of tenant, someone with the right appearance, the right circumstances, and when their pursuers came knocking, a simple switch. The real Robinsons, innocent and unknowing, played their part simply by existing, but what they didn't account for, Poirot tapped his temple, was that Hercule Poirot does not miss a trick, and with that, he turned to greet the arriving officers with a triumphant smile. The Avenger had arrived. He knew the name, he knew the address, he had waited in the shadows, biding his time, and now he struck, a single calculated move, swift and deadly. The deed was done, justice or vengeance was served, and yet, amidst the chaos, Miss Hart had once again slipped away, vanishing into the night like a ghost, escaping death by the barest thread of fate. Poirot adjusted his cuffs with an air of quiet satisfaction. "Hastings, mon ami, there is still one thing left to do. You must introduce me to the real Mrs. Robinson, that delightful and blissfully unaware lady. I imagine she will be rather puzzled when she finds her flat has been so rudely invaded." We hurried back, our pace quickening as the distant sound of heavy boots echoed closer. Poirot's sharp ears caught the rhythmic pounding on the door before I did. "Ah," he murmured, "that I believe would be our friends from Scotland Yard, arriving just in time for the grand finale." Asterisk. I turned to him, still trying to piece together the intricate web he had so effortlessly unraveled. "But how did you even know this address?" I asked, nearly breathless from the rush. Poirot gave a knowing smile. "Elementary, Hastings. The first Mrs. Robinson, the false one, was followed when she left the apartment. Simple observation, mon ami. You are learning to use your little grey cells at last." As he spoke, he reached for the door, unbolting it with a deliberate slowness. Then, in an unexpected flourish, he nudged it open just enough to slip a small black velvet cat through the gap. The effect was immediate. A piercing, unnatural meow rang through the corridor. Outside, the Scotland Yard inspector and his companion nearly leaped out of their skins. The sudden eerie sound had caught them completely off guard. "For God's sake, Poirot," the inspector exclaimed, catching his breath. "What absurdity is this?" Poirot's face appeared next, his expression one of childlike amusement. "Ah, my friend, merely a jest. Come in. You are searching for your prize, yes?" The inspector pushed past with a grunt. We've got the criminals, but the stolen goods were not on them. We need to search this place." Poirot gave a theatrical sigh. "Ah, so predictable. And yet, while you were chasing ghosts, I was solving riddles. But first, a lesson on history, if you will permit me." The inspector groaned. "Poirot, this is not the time." "Nonsense." Poirot cut him off cheerfully. "Did you know that the ancient Egyptians worshipped the cat? Even today, a black cat crossing one's path is a sign of fortune." Poirot, "Patience, my dear inspector, for you see the significance here is not in the cat itself, but what lies inside the cat." With a knowing glance, he handed the velvet-covered feline to the man standing beside the inspector. The stranger, sharp-eyed and utterly focused, took the cat and pressed his fingers against its plush fabric. His touch was precise, practiced, an expert at work. A moment later, his hand stopped, his expression shifting from intrigue to certainty. Silence hung in the air as he reached inside the lining. Then, click, a hidden seam, a concealed pocket, and within it, the glitter of something unmistakable. The man exhaled, lifting his gaze to Poirot, his face betraying a flicker of admiration. "Mr. Poirot," he said, voice crisp with an unmistakable American twang, "that was a damn clever trick." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "Ah, but of course, allow me to introduce you, Hastings. This is Mr. Burt, United States Secret Service. The case of the missing jewels, I believe it is now closed." Burt, still holding the velvet cat, extended a hand, his tone filled with gratitude. "Pleased to meet you, gentlemen. And Mr. Poirot, I owe you one." Poirot simply smiled, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "Ah, mon ami, the pleasure is all mine." And with that, another case was brilliantly concluded.